Imagine using divine intelligence instead of physical power to ascend to the throne. Born in chaos, Solomon was destined for greatness as the son of David, the greatest king of Israel. He became the wisest ruler in history after rising from a country split apart by betrayal and war. However, authority is a terrifying temptation that comes with unrivaled wealth and wisdom. Solomon's reign started with unheard-of levels of influence, prosperity, and peace. His dominion was a beacon of prosperity, a source of jealousy for nations, and an expression of God's favor. But beyond the shiny exterior, there lurked a secret problem. Solomon's insatiable desires, worry about foreign connections, and avarice will ultimately bring him to ruin. How could the most intelligent monarch in history fall so low? How did Solomon become a warning about unrealized potential, rather than a king who founded an empire? Was he the greatest tragedy or the greatest king of Israel? This movie will examine the rise and fall of Solomon, the king who had everything before losing it all. Come discover the insight, achievements, and ultimate downfall of a man who changed Israel forever, and whose tale still serves as a powerful cautionary tale today. The beginning of Solomon's life is a time of enormous scandal and turmoil. Instead of honor, he was born into a life of betrayal and shame. The greatest ruler of Israel was his father, David, who brought the tribes together and made the kingdom a stronghold. David's devotion to God, his military prowess, and his sincere compassion for his people made him famous. However, even the most pious individuals can falter. The story of Solomon's birth was one of tragedy, deceit, and longing. King David first noticed Bathsheba, a stunning woman, from the rooftop of his castle one tragic night. She was the spouse of one of David's most loyal soldiers, Uriah, who was away fighting. David let his passion rule his actions rather than renouncing his moral principles. When he called Bathsheba to the palace, they had an affair that led to an unexpected pregnancy. In an attempt to hide his guilt, David called Uriah back from the battlefield, thinking he would have an affair with his wife and take the child as his own. But while his fellow soldiers battled and lost their lives on the battlefield, Uriah, a man of honor, refused to indulge in the comforts of home. David made a disastrous attempt to hide the affair. David therefore orchestrated Uriah's murder out of despair, sending him to the front lines of combat, where he would undoubtedly perish. David's life was irrevocably changed by this deed. The pain of Bathsheba, the death of a loyal warrior, and the consequences of David's sin were not insignificant to God. God sent Nathan, the prophet, to confront David and tell him, "You are the man." 2 Samuel 12:7. Nathan revealed David's transgression, which led to the consequences. Because of her sinful conception, Bathsheba's child would die. Furthermore, despite David's heart tearing with sadness, God's mercy was evident even in the midst of judgment. Bathsheba became pregnant again after grieving the loss of her first child, but the baby was different this time. Solomon was the child's name, and his birth was characterized by restoration as opposed to controversy. It proved that even in the most dire situations, God is able to repair and redeem. The birth of Solomon showed how God might change something ugly and sinful into something beautiful. However, why Solomon? Why did God select Solomon when several of David's other sons were older, more powerful, and better suited to take the throne? The answer lies in God's boundless wisdom. Solomon wasn't the strongest, the oldest, or the most obvious choice, but the prophet Nathan attested to God's selection of him. Solomon stayed the chosen one, the one God would elevate to a position of authority, while other sons, like Amnon and Absalom, resorted to immorality and rebellion. There were difficulties along Solomon's path to the throne. While David was still alive, his older brother Adoniah organized a coup and proclaimed himself king. But Solomon's rule began when he was crowned king, with Bathsheba's help and Nathan's guidance. More than just power, fate played a role in Solomon's ascent. Solomon has always stood for the forgiveness and salvation of God. His life served as evidence that God is able to produce amazing things, even in the midst of sin and failure. In addition to being the son of David and Bathsheba, Solomon was God's chosen son and the man who would guide Israel into its golden age. Solomon's path to the throne was not straightforward or risk-free. Despite beginning in the shadow of scandal, Solomon's life story ultimately transformed into a tale of fate, replete with conflicts over loyalty and power. In many respects, Solomon was the least likely candidate to inherit the throne because he was not King David's firstborn son. Amnon, David's firstborn son, was the logical heir, but his actions revealed his true nature. He had attacked his own sister, a terrible crime, and as a result, God had rejected him. Next in line was Absalom, David's son, and a brilliant leader with aspirations to rule. Absalom's hubris, however, sparked a rebellion, and his tragic demise validated his right to the kingdom. David's older sons lost God's favor due to their immoral behavior and conceited aspirations. Solomon was God's chosen heir, even though he was the youngest and appeared to be the least ready for the throne. The prophet Nathan, who had already given David a terrible revelation, exposing his complicity with Bathsheba and Uriah's murder, would confirm this choice. Now, Nathan would be crucial in deciding Solomon's destiny. A power struggle broke out when the elderly and weak King David knew he was nearing the end of his reign. David's second son, Adoniah, decided to handle the situation himself. Adoniah proclaimed himself king while David was still alive, gathered powerful religious and military leaders to support him, and threw a lavish feast to commemorate his coronation. David's followers, however, were steadfast in their belief that Solomon would replace him. Nathan, the prophet, and Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, acted immediately. They reminded David of God's command as they marched before him. David's response in his last moments was decisive. In order to keep the kingdom safe, David asked that Solomon be crowned king. Following Adoniah's unsuccessful coronation, Solomon was crowned. Adoniah's supporters turned away from him as the trumpets blew and the audience screamed, "Long live King Solomon!" And he realized his claim was no longer valid. The transition was not without risk, though. Refusing to concede defeat, Adoniah sought to increase his power in a more subdued manner by asking Bathsheba to convince Solomon to permit him to wed Abishag, the young woman who had looked after David in his later years. Solomon viewed the request as a power grab, since he understood the political repercussions. He moved swiftly, vanquishing Adoniah to stop any more attempts to overthrow his rule. To make his rule stronger was a difficult but necessary decision. Solomon dealt with his enemies after Adoniah fled. Solomon's kingdom was assured by his early actions, but the bigger question was whether he could reign justly as God's chosen man, or if power would corrupt him like it had so many others. Solomon's struggles as a man and a ruler were far from over, but this was the beginning of a story that would see Israel transform from a faltering monarchy to a strong empire. Securing a throne was only one aspect of Solomon's ascent. Another was the choices he would make in order to govern a country and live in accordance with God's will. Will he be wise enough to bring about a golden age for Israel? Or will even the most intelligent king in history be overcome by the temptations of power? A turning point in Israel's history, David's final words and Solomon's initial deeds. David's final breath marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new one that would shape Israel's destiny for thousands of years to come. Solomon, a scandal-born prince destined for grandeur, bore the burden of the kingdom, while David's sickly body lay in his apartments. Solomon's ascent to the throne, however, was a fight for survival, authority, and legitimacy, rather than a simple coronation. In a moment that would forever alter the path of history, David called Solomon to his side just before he died. This was a kingly passing of the torch, flavored with wisdom, responsibility, and maybe even a trace of regret, rather than a fatherly conversation full of passionate advice. David gave Solomon the simple advice: be strong, show yourself a man, and walk in obedience to the Lord your God. However, David's counsel went beyond that. As a parent who had seen betrayal, rebellion, and conflict, David forewarned Solomon of the names of persons who had wronged him and disobeyed God. Justice and the survival of Solomon's reign depended on dealing with these persons. Adoniah, Solomon's older brother, was one of the most prominent people on David's list, since he tried to take the throne while David was still alive. The monarchy had been shaken by Adoniah's bold self-coronation, but Solomon's ascent to power was now assured. David had already made his decision, and Solomon now needed to back it. Solomon knew that Adoniah would not accept his son's earlier acts of charity. Adoniah expressed his intention to overthrow Solomon's dominion by subtly requesting the hand of a woman who had previously belonged to the monarch. Solomon took immediate action by ordering his brother's execution, ensuring that the heir apparent would no longer pose a threat. It was the decisive moment. This issue was driven more by political necessity than by cruelty. Because Adoniah had not learned humility, Solomon ruled that no one would contest the throne. Nevertheless, Adoniah was not the last name on the list. David had once trusted Joab to lead him, but Joab had deceived him, committed crimes, and helped Adoniah rebel. Like Adoniah, he required removal and found solace at the altar of God. Solomon, however, had no sympathy, since he understood that Israel's prosperity depended on the eradication of historical wrongdoing and the prosecution of his father's enemies. Shimei, the last name on David's list, had taunted David while he was in distress and had made fun of him while he was escaping Absalom's uprising. Although Solomon was now firmly entrenched as king, he was determined to make sure that no one could challenge his authority, even though David had once spared him. Solomon gave Shimei the option to stay in Jerusalem and live. But you will die if you go, even for one night. Shimei chose to disobey the king's order, and Solomon finally fulfilled his promise by killing Shimei as he crossed over. By his acts, Solomon not only solidified his power, but also removed any potential challenges to it. He proclaimed that everyone, including his family, was subject to punishment, and that his power was absolute. But rather than being driven by animosity, these actions were taken with Israel's future in mind. Power, wisdom, and unwavering adherence to God's purpose would dominate the kingdom instead of weakness or uncertainty. Early in his rule, Solomon demonstrated an awareness of the responsibility of the throne and the price of power. Solomon heard his father's last words: "Be strong, walk in obedience, and be a man of wisdom." For Solomon, these words were a call to action, not merely a statement. As he continued his father's legacy, Solomon also showed that he was more than just David's son. He was the king Israel needed to usher in a new century. Perhaps Solomon's most remarkable dream was when God promised him anything he wanted. Put yourself in Solomon's position for a second. The creator of the universe is in front of you, ready to give you anything you want. It might have been the richest country in the world, an unbeatable empire, or even the power to defeat all of your enemies. The possibilities were endless. However, Solomon, who was young and modest, made a unique request. Solomon made a request that stunned even the heavens. Rather than requesting wealth or fame, he prayed to God for wisdom. According to Solomon, "I am only a small child, and I do not know how to carry out my responsibilities." 1 Kings 3:9. Develop a discerning heart in your servant, so that they can guide your people and differentiate between right and wrong. He made no requests for riches, immortality, or vengeance. Instead, Solomon prayed for wisdom to govern justly, guide his people wisely, and discern right from wrong. God was pleased. God's answer was really amazing. God not only granted Solomon's request for wisdom, but also promised him much more. "Because you requested this, rather than a long life or prosperity for yourself, I will fulfill your request. I will give you a knowledgeable and discerning heart, so that no one has ever been like you and never will be. I will also give you money and honor you did not ask for, so you will be unmatched among kings in your lifetime." 1:3-13. Solomon's reign would be unlike anything Israel or the world had ever experienced because of these declarations. Think about the significance of that promise. God had promised Solomon unparalleled riches and grandeur, in addition to being the smartest man in history. Solomon was going to be crowned with unheard-of wealth, favor, and wisdom after the heavens opened. It was the kind of divine favor that might shape an empire. However, asking for wisdom was not the real test of it. The true test of wisdom was Solomon's application of his extraordinary talent. Solomon's initial test was swift and spectacular. 2 women approached him, claiming to be the mothers of the same child. They lived together, were both prostitutes, and both had sons. Tragically, one of the infants had passed away during the night, and the grieving mother had exchanged her dead kid for the living one. Solomon shocked the court by ordering the 2 women to divide the living infant in half. The second woman, horrified, had learned of the deception, and both ladies demanded that Solomon reveal who the real mother was. Solomon had no witnesses, no proof, and no way to confirm the truth, so he offered an unusual solution: "Bring me a sword." However, the real mother suddenly screamed and begged Solomon to spare the child and deliver him to the other woman. After acknowledging her sincere request, Solomon quickly proclaimed her to be the real mother. "Give the baby to her," is what Solomon said. "She is his mother." Israel as a whole was taken aback by this astute and surprising decision. Solomon demonstrated his unparalleled wisdom by seeing the truth when all the evidence seemed to be against it. His reputation quickly grew. At this point, Solomon's wisdom became famous as people from all over the world started to whisper about the young king who had the ability to see right into the heart of issues and make incredibly clear decisions. He was the world's wisest ruler and the most intelligent monarch in Israel's history because of his ability to listen, perceive, and act justly. Throughout his administration, Solomon's discernment and wisdom were evident. He went on to write the Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Proverbs, all of which are still relevant today. He looked into the deepest realities of the human heart, the secrets of nature, and the mysteries of creation. Solomon's story is a wonderful example of the power of intelligence. Kings from nearby nations traveled to hear him speak and absorb his wisdom, which poured forth like a flood. It was more than a scholarly gift. It created nations, altered the course of history, and exalted God. Based on his wise choices, Solomon's rule would turn into Israel's golden age, marked by exceptional success, peace, and wealth. Solomon's wisdom was truly legendary, and one of the most striking instances of his unparalleled judgment took place in a case that would become a hallmark of his reign. It all began with a straightforward request for wisdom, a request that would alter everything. One day, two women confronted King Solomon with a distressing circumstance. Living in the same home, both women were prostitutes who had recently given birth to a boy. One night, however, tragedy struck when one of the women unintentionally overturned while she was sleeping, drowning her child. The grieving mother exchanged the dead child for the surviving one in a desperate and tragic act, placing the dead body in the arms of the other woman. The second lady woke up the following morning to the devastating discovery that the child she was cuddling was not her own. She accused the other mother of kidnapping her child and promptly informed the authorities that the baby was not hers. The second woman fiercely defended her claim that the living infant was hers, rejecting the accusation. There were no witnesses, no physical proof, and the situation seemed hopeless. Both women refused to give up because they were desperate. Seeking justice, they made their case before King Solomon. Solomon, who was renowned for his wisdom, paid close attention to the arguments made by both women. Everyone in the court was anxious about how the king would handle this seemingly unsolvable issue. They spoke, but Solomon was not convinced. Rather, he called for a sword to appear. He made the horrible comment, "Cut the living child in two and give half to one woman and half to the other." The court became silent, and the room exploded in shock. This appeared to be insane. Solomon was paying close attention, though, and his movements were deliberate. Something unexpected happened when he raised the sword. "My lord, please, do not harm the child. Give him to her. I would rather lose him than see him die." The other woman, icy and unmoved, replied, "Neither I nor she shall have him. Sever him in two." Solomon now recognized the true mother of the child, who was overcome with love and desperation, and instantly went to her knees. He ordered the mother, who had shown sympathy and understanding, to receive the living child. The court was left in awe of his quick conclusion. There were unexpected instances in which Solomon's wisdom was evident. It was amazing how he was able to determine the truth, even in the absence of proof. This occurrence was more than just a moment of justice. It was a dramatic manifestation of Solomon's divine wisdom. The story of Solomon's judgment quickly traveled throughout the kingdom, and soon everyone in Israel heard about the king who had the understanding to handle the most complicated of situations. He stood out from past kings due to his keen sense of justice, understanding of human nature, and capacity to see through deceit. Foreign leaders from distant countries wanted to see this amazing king for themselves, and the Israelites were in awe. Solomon's fame went far beyond Israel's boundaries, and his wisdom became legendary. However, what really set Solomon's wisdom apart was not just his ability to make decisions that seemed impossible, but also how he applied this knowledge throughout his rule. Whether in leadership, diplomacy, or interpersonal interactions, Solomon's depth of understanding set him apart from all other monarchs of his time. In addition to being a gift from God, his wisdom was a reflection of his heart. which aspired to provide just, equitable, and compassionate service to the people of Israel. Solomon's landmark ruling in this instance came to represent his whole reign. It highlighted the special qualities that set him apart as one of Israel's greatest rulers: knowledge, insight, and the capacity to make choices that would have a lasting impact on the future of his country. That moment would forever cement his reputation as the smartest king in history. Israel enjoyed previously unheard-of levels of wealth and prestige under Solomon's rule. The nation transitioned from a kingdom fighting for survival to a worldwide empire during this heyday. In contrast to his father, King David, who had engaged in countless conflicts to protect Israel's boundaries, Solomon saw that diplomacy, not force, would determine Israel's future. Solomon was aware of something that most kings of his era were not. A kingdom's actual strength is determined by how many amicable alliances it can forge, rather than how many wars it wins. Solomon adopted a novel strategy to subjugate nearby countries, eschewing conflict and murder. He desired to build bridges rather than walls. His shrewd diplomatic abilities allowed him to establish important ties with strong neighboring empires. Egypt, Tyre, Arabia, and several neighboring countries developed into important trading partners, providing Israel with resources, money, and exotic goods that were beyond the reach of most nations at the time. A hub of culture, knowledge, and authority, Solomon's court attracted tourists and traders from all over the world. It was a magnificent spectacle. Solomon's ability to marry into the most influential royal households of the day was one of his greatest diplomatic successes. He established political ties that ensured Israel's stability and wealth by marrying princesses from Tyre, Egypt, and other strong nations. These unions were not only romantic, but also calculated. Every alliance improved Israel's standing internationally and made the monarchy unassailable by its enemies. Solomon's alliances were based on a deep knowledge of geopolitics, which made sure Israel remained at peace with its neighbors while becoming more powerful than ever. Making sensible choices for his people was only one aspect of Solomon's wisdom. Its goal was to create an atmosphere that would allow Israel to prosper through economic expansion and peaceful coexistence. Israel developed into a commercial center that linked ancient empires. Israel saw immense prosperity as a result of the caravans that brought gold, silver, spices, and exotic animals. As the kingdom expanded, Solomon's name came to represent peace, wealth, and wisdom. But the empire was more than simply wealth. It was also a symbol of intellectual and cultural accomplishment. Solomon supported education, science, and the arts, in addition to being a politician. As scholars, philosophers, and scientists from all over the world gathered to hear Solomon's lectures, knowledge and wisdom blossomed throughout his rule. His works, such as the Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Proverbs, served as the foundation for the majority of Israel's intellectual heritage. A leader who understood that true grandeur comes from wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. Solomon was more than just a king. He was a representation of human potential. Solomon's rule was, in many respects, the height of Israel's dominance in antiquity. In addition to being wealthy, Solomon's realm had unmatched authority. Israel was no longer a tiny, precarious Middle Eastern nation. It became a global superpower under Solomon, proving the value of knowledge, diplomacy, and strategic partnerships. Solomon's reign was unparalleled in Israel's history. Despite his enormous achievements, Solomon's biography takes a tragic turn, serving as a warning about the dangers of power and the repercussions of straying from one's morals. It was a period of peace and prosperity, and Israel was at the center of the ancient world. with influence that stretched far beyond its borders. Solomon's early reign was characterized by extraordinary wisdom as he established Israel as a center of riches and power in the world, constructed a thriving kingdom, and maintained peace. In addition to writing some of the most important books in biblical history, such as Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon, he amassed enormous wealth and constructed the majestic Temple of Solomon. But as time went on, his foundation started to be undermined by the very elements that had made him great: the desire for wealth, power, and pleasure. Solomon's concern for international relations was one of his most glaring shortcomings. He married a lot of women, many of whom were foreigners, which was a common political tactic in the past. These unions were not without restrictions, though. Through these relationships, Solomon forged peace treaties and ensured the dominance of his empire. But he also permitted the worship of foreign gods to infiltrate his realm. The situation deteriorated as Solomon's heart started to change. Solomon, the man who had previously built a magnificent temple to the God of Israel, now permitted the worship of foreign deities in the land that had once been a stronghold of righteousness. His foreign brides had a negative effect on his once unwavering devotion to God. Over time, these women, many of whom were from countries that worshipped idols, led Solomon astray. He compromised his spiritual purity for political security by building temples to foreign gods, which caused his devotion to the one true God to diminish. Once ruling with wisdom and seeking God's will, the clever monarch now found himself entangled in a web of pleasure and compromise. Solomon's ambition for wealth and power was a major factor in his demise, but so were his relationships with his wives. Solomon's vast empire attracted money because it was based on trade and diplomacy. But there was a cost to this obsession with worldly gain. To fund his expensive projects and maintain his rule, Solomon taxed his citizens heavily and made them labor. Solomon's ambition for riches and power ultimately impairs his judgment, causing his empire to fall apart internally. Although his rule brought prosperity, it also led to unhappiness among the populace, which would plague Israel in the years to come. His sons, in contrast to Solomon, lacked the leadership and wisdom that had once propelled Israel to lofty heights. Despite its vast wealth and breadth, Solomon's empire was in disarray at the time of his death. Solomon's tragic end serves as a sobering reminder that success cannot be guaranteed by wisdom alone. The unity that had characterized his rule had disappeared, and Israel was quickly split into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, signaling the beginning of a protracted period of separation and decline. Starting well is not enough. Finishing well is also essential. His narrative depicts a man who had everything, only to lose it all due to his misguided priorities. Ultimately, Solomon's rule acted as a warning to succeeding generations, reminding them that, despite their allure, pleasure, wealth, and power can drive even the most intelligent people to ruin if they are not counterbalanced by morality and unwavering faith. Even though Solomon was the greatest king of Israel, his decline from grace serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of arrogance, idolatry, and compromise. When we consider the life of King Solomon, we are reminded of the complexity of human nature and the thin line separating intelligence from foolishness. The strength of a humble, astute leader is best demonstrated by Solomon's ascent to grandeur, which was driven by divine insight and a readiness to seek God's direction. But his decline shows how easily the things we value most, wealth, influence, and power, can distort our souls and take us in the wrong direction. For me, Solomon's narrative serves as a warning as much as an inspiration. It serves as a potent reminder that living a successful life involves more than just achieving our objectives or learning new perspectives. It also entails staying true to our core beliefs and values. Solomon's formative years show the amazing potential that every one of us has when we align our choices with more ambitious objectives. But as his story goes on, it forces us to face a painful truth. We, too, can get lost if we don't pay attention to ourselves and maintain our humility. His experience makes us think about the dangers of excess and the importance of finding balance in our lives. The key takeaway from this is that real knowledge is doing the correct thing every day, rather than merely knowing it. Whether in relationships, leadership, or personal growth, our most challenging challenges are often internal rather than external. Solomon's life serves as a reminder that, although seeking wisdom is vital, it must be coupled with humility and deference to higher ideals. I want you to consider what you value most in your own life. How can you make sure that, particularly during prosperous times, your choices align with your values? Let's begin a conversation on how we might live a life of integrity, wisdom, and purpose, while avoiding the mistakes Solomon made. Give your thoughts, and together, let's develop.